So the situation of the Jewish people 150 years ago was awful. Awful, any way you look at it. And we've done incredible things in the last century and a half. We've ingathered a broken and scattered people back to their historic homeland. We've made a desert bloom. We've revived a dead language to everyday use. I don't know if you appreciate how revolutionary that is. The Irish have tried, the Indians have tried, the Aztecs are trying. No other people in history have revived a dead language to everyday use. Right? But we've done it. And we've beaten the British Empire militarily. We liberated our homeland from the British Empire. That's huge. I mean, now it doesn't seem huge, but at the time it was huge. And we achieved all of this through a very necessary, narrow, particularist Jewish nationalism called Zionism that expressed itself in that time, as Josh said, through what looked like, like 19th century European nationalism, through the vehicle of 19th century European nationalism. But I think that everything we are going to achieve through that narrow nationalism has been achieved. We're done. We're post-Zionist now. Now it's time to transition from a narrow Jewish nationalism to a very uniquely Hebrew universalism. That's the next step. The next step is not to shrink the nationalism to make room for universalism, but rather the nationalism explodes into universalism. Right? And we have to start struggling with different questions. Like, what is the ideal role of the non-Jew in a Jewish society? It's a question we haven't asked ourselves because we've had a conflict for 90 years. But if you look at our history, even if you look at the Tanakh in the Bible, you see there are heroes of Jewish history who lived in our country and were not Jewish. And to this day, Jewish parents all over the world, including in our country, in Israel, name their daughters Yael. Yael was a Druzia. She wasn't Jewish.
It's probably anachronistic to call her Druze.
Well, the Druzim consider themselves the Canaan.
Okay.
They consider themselves the children of Yitro, and that's what the Canaan for sure were.
Okay.
So I don't like to tell people what their identity is. The Druzim claim that they're the descendants of Yitro, so that would make her a Druzia from the Druzi narrative. Okay?
Sure.
She's a non-Jewish woman living in our homeland who's a hero of our history to the point that to this day, 3,000 years later, people still name their daughters after her. Right? That means that not every Gentile is the enemy. Right? That means in situations where we have power in our own country, there are different categories of non-Jews. There are Bnei Noach, there's Ger Toshav, there's Amalek. These are three very different categories. And we're still stuck in a very exilic mindset because for 2,000 years, there was two categories of human beings, Jews and Gentiles, and for the most part, Gentiles were the enemy. Gentiles were the persecutor in most of our experiences. So we need to get past that. We need to realize that reality is more complex today. And on both sides, meaning I'm a Kohen. That makes me different from other Hebrews. Right? I'm in a different category. And on the other side, there are different categories. So we have to struggle with new questions. And we have to think about what are the goals of our revolution now, post this narrow Jewish nationalism, post achieving. And I don't want to compromise on what we've achieved. I want to maintain what we've achieved. The Hebrew language, the land of Israel, independence, ingathering of exiles should continue. But now the question is, what are the goals for this generation? Like, who is going to be the next Eliezer ben Yehuda? Who is going to be the next Yair Stern? Who is going to be the next Herzl? And what are they going to be accomplishing that make them those people? What will they accomplish to make them those people? Right? Because what are the next goals? Now, I personally believe, I don't want to superimpose what I think the next steps are on you, but I'll tell you what I think they are. I think they are peace, and when I talk about peace, I mean unity. And when I mean unity, I mean Israel as an organic part of the Middle East, which means we sit with other Middle Eastern countries at the UN and we vote as a bloc. Our soccer team does not play against Greece and Spain and France, but against Egypt and Iraq and Bahrain. We become an organic, accepted part of the Middle East. That's peace for me. Unity. Semitic unity. And the other goal is independence. That we shouldn't be taking money or weapons from the United States. And we shouldn't be the Robin to America's Batman or a Western satellite in the Middle East, because that is the number one obstacle to peace. Israel can shrink to Herzliya. As long as we insist on being a Western country, we will never be accepted by our neighbors, nor should we be, because that makes us colonialist. We have to decide, are we indigenous? Are we natives? Do we belong in the Middle East? Or are we a Western country? Because there's no such thing as both for one reason and one reason only: we're not living in the West. So if you're living in the Middle East, you either belong there or you don't. I happen to think we do. And I think most people who take a walk from the old city of Jerusalem to the central bus station realize they're not in a Western country. But we have a ruling class that very much wants to be white. Israel has a ruling class that wants to be part of the West, and a lot of my Palestinian colleagues say the number one obstacle to peace from your side, from the Jewish side, is that you insist on being part of the West, and even when your leaders engage in dialogue with Egypt or Jordan or Syria or the Palestinian Authority, you're doing it to be close to America and Europe because they're making you do it and not because you genuinely want solidarity with the other peoples in the Middle East. You see them as beneath you. And as long as we have that attitude, that we are the benevolent white man, whatever our politics are, right wing, left wing, doesn't matter. Right? As long as we have this attitude that we are the white men and they are the savages, we're not going to have peace. As long as we have this attitude that we are lambs and they are wolves, and the only way we can protect ourselves from the wolves are with walls and checkpoints and guns, we're not going to have peace. And because our ruling class wants to be Western, millions of Palestinians are living under occupation. Because the Jews in Judea are not the Americans in Afghanistan. Right? We're in our own homeland. The problem is we have policies like the Americans in Afghanistan. Our army and our government behave the way Western powers behave when they're occupying the third world. The policies resemble the policies of an occupation force. So I'd argue that Israel's military occupation of the West Bank actually undermines the Jewish people's legitimate rights to Judea and Samaria. And it solidifies in the minds of the Palestinians that we don't belong there. Sandbags, walls, checkpoints, soldiers with helmets and bulletproof vests and M16s controlling their lives, that's what the British did when they ruled our country. That's what the French did in Algeria. That's what the Americans do in Afghanistan. And that's not what the Jews should be doing in Judea. Because just by doing that, we're sending the message that we don't belong there. We're behaving like we don't belong there. And we shouldn't be surprised when they respond to us as if we don't belong there.
You talked a little before about how you're getting people from the radical factions of each side to talk to each other. And I'm just curious because I've done a lot of work with Seeds of Peace where as actually I was 14 and a lot of people were like 13 to 15 and
coming from where? Do you know where in the country they're coming from?
So I think a lot were from, for Israel, a lot were from Jerusalem, a lot were from like Haifa, some were from, like one of my good friends is from Mala Adumim, and then...
So the Arabs were Israeli citizens?
No.
Okay.
So some were, like we had one from Gaza, which was a really big deal. Some lived in Jerusalem. They tried to get as diverse of a group as possible, but obviously that's difficult for lots of reasons. And also, very few were very extreme.
Well, the kids.
That's true too, but I'm just curious because I've had a lot of experience with that at a very young age, and I'm just curious what your experiences have been watching. How old are the people that you're working with? Not
usually
14.
Usually in their 20s and 30s.
So I'm just curious what that looks like with a different age and also...
With different experiences. Because, for example, most of the Palestinians who are meeting with us are people who served time in prison for political violence. Throwing Molotov cocktails, sniping on the roads, whatever it is. Maybe throwing rocks, at least. And most of the Jews who I'm bringing to the table are people who, fight with Arabs over olive trees and might, and they're coming from, and they're the ones who are feared. Like, they're the ones who, like, the government suspects of, like, Tag Mahir, if you know what that is, like, price tag, and, and of, political violence against Palestinians.
Well, I'm just curious because it was so hard to just have a mutual understanding where people would listen and hear and not say, well, that's wrong. Your experience that you just had didn't, that you
Right.
said. So I'm just curious. I just
Okay,
don't,
so
I can't even
I'll try to
fathom
answer.
how it would be.
I give a tour of Hebron once a week, a dual narrative tour, where I give half the tour and a Palestinian gives half the tour. It's the only tour of its kind. That people, mostly white people, from Europe, America, come, and they stay in a hostel in Jerusalem, and they get to take this tour. And they get, it's not like the Palestinian and I, decide in advance what we're going to say. We give our own tours. Now, I obviously might give a more nuanced tour because I'm also involved with peace activism, so they wouldn't be getting from me, the generic, right-wing Hebron tour. I try to include that, or you could read that on the wall. It's like walking up and down the street. But I try to include that, but also step back and give a bigger perspective. But one of the things I say to participants on the program is, if I tell you what motivates Palestinians or what they're experiencing, don't believe me. Let them tell you what they're experiencing. Let's say, I don't know if you guys know who Shalhevet Pass was. Do you know Shalhevet Pass? Know the story?
The baby.
Yeah, she was a 10-month-old baby who was sitting on her mother's lap in Hebron. She's from Hebron. And a sniper, a Palestinian sniper, aimed for her head and squeezed the trigger. Right? Her head exploded while on her mother's lap, a 10-month-old baby. Okay? And it wasn't a stray bullet. It was a sniper bullet. Okay? I'm not going to begin to try and explain what's going through the Palestinian's head who did that. Okay? And also, when you go on the tour with the Palestinian, accept what he says about his experiences, what it is to live under a military occupation, what his aspirations are, what he wants. But when he starts to tell you why Jews live in Hebron, take it with a grain of salt. And it's amazing what he says. He says that all of the Jews who live there are being paid by the government to live there, which is ridiculous because the government is constantly trying to find ways to throw them out. Golda Meir even built Kiryat Arba to get the Jews out of Hebron. And even in the last 12 years since I've been in Israel, there have been plenty of Jewish house demolitions and forced expulsions from neighborhoods in Hebron. They also, this Palestinian says that all the Jews living in Hebron are from America. I would be surprised if more than 5% of the Jews in Hebron speak English. And Hebron's an interesting place because it's somewhere, there's only 39 years in the last 3,000 years of history where Jews were not living in Hebron. Right? From 1929 until 1968, Jews were not in Hebron. But before that, they were there for thousands of years. And some of the Jews who live there today are actually the grandchildren of the Jews who were expelled in 1929. So the fact that the world says we're not allowed to live in Hebron is a little bit ridiculous. But ultimately there's a bigger story, and that's what we're not getting to yet. We're talking about their story, and we're talking about our story, and both stories are true. And both stories need to get beyond this sense of insecurity that their story can't coexist with mine because both are true, both are happening. And the bigger story is actually a better story. The bigger story is actually a more interesting story, full of plot twists and all sorts of surprises that are exciting for me as an activist who's involved with this on a daily basis, discovering new things and hearing things from my Palestinian comrades and discovering information just, on the internet that kind of, fills a couple gaps in things we've been talking about. And it's amazing. But it's important to first clarify what we want. So the question is, hundreds of years ago, did the Jewish people in ghettos throughout the world dream about one day having a booming high-tech sector? No. It's nice to have one, but I'm not saying we shouldn't. But we just have to be able to compartmentalize what is a core aspiration and what is something that, we might have to have by necessity or want to have as a luxury, but not necessarily central to what we've wanted for thousands of years, what we've been after, what we've aspired towards. Have we wanted a big ugly wall through the middle of our country? Have we wanted to oppress a minority population? Because we are. That's something we're doing today. And I know this because I'm a soldier. It's very real. And a lot of the things that the SJP or whatever it's called in Colombia, a lot of things they say are true. That's why it's so compelling. A lot of what they're saying is actually true, and it's wrong, and we should be fighting against it. But not fighting against it by trying to throw hundreds and thousands of Jews from their homes and shrinking the borders of the country and building a big wall and forcing millions of Palestinians to live under an American-backed police state, which they call Dayton's Republic. That's the Palestinian slang term for the PA. Do you guys know who Keith Dayton was? Or is? Keith Dayton is the American general who arms and trains the Palestinian militias, Mahmoud Abbas's forces, who go out and persecute all his political opponents. I live next to the Jalazun refugee camp. I see it from my window, like I live in a place that nobody ever expected Jews to live. And there was a man a couple weeks ago, 39 years old, he had a son, and he decided to name his son Morsi. And he was arrested for naming his son Morsi. Last Hanukkah, a Palestinian was arrested for making fun of Mahmoud Abbas on Facebook, and he was sentenced to 1 year in prison. This is a law on the books, by the way. It's an old Jordanian law called wagging your tongue against the king. He was sentenced to 1 year in prison for criticizing Mahmoud Abbas on Facebook, and somebody else got 6 months for clicking like. This is not a state people should be forced to live under. Now, Mahmoud Abbas just entered the 10th year of a 4-year term, right? And I don't blame him for this, because he's tried to step down, and he's tried to hold elections. But America won't let him, because they fear that if there are democratic elections among Palestinians, a candidate will win who won't play ball with Washington's interests in the region. And Mahmoud Abbas can be trusted to cooperate with Washington, because he owes his life to Washington at this point. Salam Fayyad, do you guys know who Salam Fayyad was? He's until recently the Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority. Do you know when he was elected? He wasn't elected. He was appointed by George W. Bush. He was appointed by George W. Bush to be the Prime Minister of Palestine. Before that, he was an economist at the World Bank and the IMF. Palestinians don't want this. But if they say so publicly, they're killed. Right? Just like if they sell property to Jews, they're killed. So what do they want? The nation state, like you alluded to before, is a very European concept. Although one of my students is getting her PhD in UCLA, a very interesting subject on the relationship between Lehi, the Stern Group, and the Arabs. There are a lot of Arabs in Lehi. I don't know if you guys know that. But she mentioned to me that one of the things she recently discovered is that the European concept of nationalism was actually based on the ancient Hebrews. So it's not foreign to us, but it's foreign to the Palestinians. It's foreign to most of the peoples in the Middle East, because they were living without nation states and without flags. And this is one of the things that's very confusing about the conflict, because when we say, or when some Jews say there's no such thing as Palestinians, or there never was a Palestine, what are they really saying? They're saying they have no history of self-determination. Until a couple decades ago, they never called themselves Palestinians. They didn't have a national leader before Arafat. They never had their own currency. They don't have their own national history, right? They don't have a history of sovereignty. That's true, but why does it matter? That's not how they're defining Palestinian identity. They don't mean that. It's hard for us to understand because we do have those things. And we're still finding, in my part of the country, we're finding ancient Hebrew coins from when we were independent and when we did fight for our freedom from foreign rule against the Greeks and the Romans. Right? So because we have a history of sovereignty and our own unique language and our own unique coinage, like we say, well, they don't have any of that, so why do they have a right to state? But what the Palestinians mean when they say Palestinian, when they talk about Palestinian national identity, they mean the indigenous peoples of Palestine throughout time, including my ancestors and yours. Right? Like, we're both doing the same thing here. We often take the word Zionist and we retroactively apply it to people who fought for Jewish independence thousands of years ago, like Bar Kokhba. Like in our historiography, Bar Kokhba was a Zionist. He was fighting the Romans to make a Jewish state, Jewish kingdom. But if you go back in time and ask Bar Kokhba, are you a Zionist? He'd probably look at you, what is that? And Palestinians do the same thing. Bar Kokhba would be a Palestinian. He's a Zionist Palestinian, because they're retroactively applying a term to the indigenous peoples of Palestine. And I'm not threatened by this. I'm okay with being a Palestinian. But we have to know what people mean, and we have to know what people want. We have to define our terms, like you mentioned, and we have to be sensitive to what people actually want, what people are actually aspiring towards. One thing that's not negotiable to me is Jewish independence in our historic homeland. That's something we've wanted for thousands of years, and it's not something I'm willing to compromise on. Yeah.
So if that is non-negotiable,
Yeah.
and partition is non-negotiable,
Right.
then how do you ensure that there's a moral pathway forward that doesn't involve the subjugation of
Right. So what do Palestinians need? What do they want?
a homeland,
No. That's a vague term. What do they want?
a state?
No. That's what the New York Times says they want. But what do Palestinians want?
All the Palestinians that I've read interviewed in the New York Times
Yeah.
said they want a
Right,
state.
of course. And if any of them said anything different, they'd be dead. Right. They want to live in dignity, in a society where they're equal, completely equal. That means, number one, getting rid of the checkpoints, walls, restrictions on freedom of movement, military bureaucracy, that has to go. And they should have, every single Palestinian should have the same rights and access as every single Jew. That means the same healthcare, that means the same employment opportunities, that means the same freedom of movement, that means the same access to education, access to the political process, every single thing, water, electricity, because right now they don't have equal water and electricity. They need to have everything we have. They need to live in a democratic state between the Mediterranean and the Jordan, and by the way, they won't compromise on that either. For them, it's not a solution, a two-state solution where they're forced to live under the Palestinian Authority and they don't get to live in Haifa, or they don't get to live in Tel Aviv, or they don't get to, to go to the Mediterranean Sea. Meaning Palestinians your age have never seen the Mediterranean Sea. It's a reality because of the occupation. So they don't want that. They need that gone. They need that gone. But don't make them out to be nationalists the way we are. You see, Palestinian national identity is very real today. And it's much broader than Jewish national consciousness. Meaning Palestinian nationalism, there's a higher percentage of Palestinians your age who are staunch nationalists than among Jews. Right? It's a lower percentage among Jews, that kind of nationalism. But Jewish nationalism is deeper, much deeper. Palestinian nationalism is very similar to like Jewish identity based on the Holocaust. Right? It's a negative national identity based on the oppression they're feeling. The Nakba, the checkpoints, all of the things that they talk about. You'll see in Apartheid Week all the things that make them Palestinians. But they don't say, Im eshkachach Yerushalayim tishkach yimini at their weddings. And they don't talk about next year in Jerusalem, and they haven't said that for thousands of years. In fact, I think the only Palestinians who really care about Jerusalem are the ones who live there. For the rest, it's symbolic and it's a political weapon. Right? It's not, the average Jew in New York can live his life without experiencing the conflict at all. The average Jew in Netanya can live his life without experiencing the conflict at all. But the average Palestinian in Jenin, or Tulkarem, or Beit Lechem, or Hebron, has to come in contact with the conflict every day. He experiences real oppression every day. To get to school, to get to work, he goes through a checkpoint manned by Israeli soldiers with bulletproof vests and helmets and guns, controlling his life. So his nationalism is very, very relevant. His national identity is very, very strong, right? Because he feels oppression. But it's based on the oppression. Right? And it's not like they've been dreaming about a kingdom or a state or a temple in Jerusalem for thousands of years. But they do want equality. They do want to be treated equal. So the solution, from my perspective, is one state that every Palestinian will experience as a democratic state where they have full equality, and the Jewish people will experience as a fulfillment of our aspirations for thousands of years. Why don't we define what a Jewish state is? What is a Jewish state? Does it mean a state with a majority of Jews?
It's a great question.
Or is it a state that expresses Jewish values in its policies, including how it treats a non-Jew? Meaning, we're not struggling with the questions we need to struggle with. We're stuck in old paradigms. And because we're stuck in old paradigms, people like Peter Beinhardt appear intelligent. But we need to transcend these old paradigms. We need to be speaking in a new language. Palestinians are already speaking in a new language. We're behind them. As much as we think we're smarter and they're backwards and they're savages, they're way ahead of us. Certainly on the front of propaganda, but also in terms of the development of their political thought. They're doing much better. We're stuck, and we're still having arguments that are relevant to the 1940s. We're stuck in old ideological paradigms. And we haven't yet properly transitioned into this Hebrew universalism. And there are things we're going to have to compromise on. Like, I'll be honest with you, I think I have a very strong emotional attachment to that tikva. I think it's holy. I think it was sanctified by the Jewish boys who sang it on their way to British gallows when we fought for our freedom. But I realize that there's a lot of people in my country who are not comfortable singing Hatikvah. Haredim and Arabs. And I'm willing to entertain the idea that we need a new national anthem that's inclusive enough that everybody could sing. I think we can find it by going deeper into Jewish sources. Meaning I think the Hebrew universalism will be found in the depths of our heritage. Meaning we don't need to throw like Jewish nationalist phrases into everything because that's very shallow. But if we, for example, if I say it's a Jewish value to treat a minority in my country a certain way, then just by doing it, I'm making the state more Jewish. Right? If I believe that participatory democracy is more Jewish than representative democracy, which it is, then the participatory democracy as a system is already making my country more Jewish and more democratic at the same time, and more inclusive, and it's empowering Palestinians while making my country more Jewish than it currently is. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about a Hebrew universalism. New policies that simultaneously make the country more Jewish and more democratic and more inclusive all at the same time. That's where we need to go. The full expression of our nationalism and our universalism.